Sitting Bull's Prophecy, the battle that shattered American invincibility. June 25th, 1876, a day that began with arrogance and ended in annihilation. Lieutenant Colonel George Custer was convinced his 7th Cavalry could not lose, not to savages. This is the story of how 800 Lakota and Cheyenne warriors defied an empire and won a battle so devastating it would doom their entire way of life. Who really killed Custer? Why did Reno flee? And how did a victory this stunning become a death sentence for the Plains tribes? Strap in. This is the full truth behind the Battle of Little Bighorn. On a clear Sunday afternoon, June 25th, 1876, Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer and his 7th Cavalry gazed upon one of the most vast Native American encampments ever recorded, perched on the bluffs across the Little Bighorn River. Custer's troops had trekked nearly 100 miles in their relentless pursuit of Sitting Bull, the camp's defiant leader. Their mission was to compel Sitting Bull and his alliance of Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho tribes to return to the confines of the Great Sioux Reservation. Yet Sitting Bull, having refused to sign any treaty, was determined to preserve his people's nomadic way of life, even if it meant war. Custer split his forces into 4 units, 3 companies under Captain Frederick Benteen, 3 led by Major Marcus A. Reno, 5 under his own command, and the rest guarding the ammunition and supply train. This clash, pitting the expanding might of the United States against the final resistance of the Plains tribes, would irrevocably alter the destiny of the American West. Years earlier, on April 29, 1868, the Second Treaty of Fort Laramie had been signed between the U.S. government and certain Sioux bands, formalizing the boundaries of the Great Sioux Reservation. The agreement required Native Americans to cease raids on railroads and settlers, relying instead on federal provisions for survival. Eager to consolidate its westward expansion, the U.S. sought to assimilate indigenous peoples into sedentary reservation life. But factions of the Sioux, including Sitting Bull's followers, rejected the treaty and its obligations. When gold was rumored in the Black Hills, the Army dispatched Custer in 1874 to scout a fort location and confirm the precious metal's presence. The discovery of trace gold sparked a rush of prospectors, blatantly violating the Fort Laramie terms and escalating hostilities. By 1875, the U.S. issued an ultimatum. All indigenous people outside reservations must return by January 31st, 1876, or face military reprisal. When the deadline passed unmet, the Army mobilized. In the spring of 1876, a 3-pronged campaign was launched to crush the resistance, with General George Crook advancing from Fort Fetterman in Wyoming Territory at the head of 1,000 soldiers. Colonel John Gibbon would advance eastward from Fort Ellis, following the Yellowstone River with a force of 450 men, while General Alfred Terry would move west from Fort Lincoln in the Dakota Territory, leading 879 troops, primarily the 7th Cavalry under Lieutenant Colonel George Custer. U.S. commanders believed any one of these 3 columns could overpower Sitting Bull and his estimated 800 to 1,500 warriors if encountered. Moreover, if a single detachment located the camp without the others, they were to attack immediately, as the native band's superior mobility and erratic movements made delaying risky. On June 4th, a Sundance ceremony at Deer Medicine Rocks culminated in Sitting Bull's vision. U.S. soldiers tumbling into his camp, foretelling a decisive triumph over the Bluecoats. By June 10th, Major Marcus A. Reno and 6 companies of the 7th Cavalry had been dispatched on a 10-day scout between the Powder and Tongue Rivers to pinpoint Sitting Bull's encampment. A week later, on June 17th, Crook's column clashed with Lakota and Cheyenne warriors under Crazy Horse along the Rosebud River around 10 a.m. The Battle of the Rosebud ended in a tactical Lakota victory, compelling Crook to withdraw and await reinforcements. That same day, Reno returned from reconnaissance, reporting to General Terry that he'd found deserted Lakota villages up the valley. Consequently, on June 22nd, Custer was ordered to pursue Crazy Horse with 12 companies of the 7th Cavalry, advancing up Rosebud Creek. The plan hinged on Custer striking the village, driving the warriors toward Terry and Gibbon's combined forces, and forcing their surrender. At dawn on June 25th, Custer's scouts sighted the camp, estimating 8,000 inhabitants with 1,500 to 2,000 fighters. Though Custer initially planned a dawn assault on the 26th, his scouts warned that Lakota lookouts had detected them. Fearing the village would scatter beyond reach, Custer resolved to attack at once. The camp sprawled across the Little Bighorn's floodplain, flanked by rugged bluffs to the east. Custer split his force. Reno would charge the southern end, while Custer skirted the bluffs to assault the north, with Benteen held in reserve. At approximately 3 p.m., Reno forded the Little Bighorn and galloped toward the village, unaware of its true scale, obscured by riverside timber. Once past the bend, the enormity of the encampment became clear. Suspecting an ambush, Reno halted his men, ordering them to dismount and form a skirmish line before opening fire. Reno's men poured gunfire into the village for 20 minutes, their shots striking warriors and non-combatants without distinction. Despite the prolonged engagement, only one of Reno's soldiers had fallen, but Lakota and Cheyenne fighters soon massed in a sheltered position and assailed the left flank of his skirmish line, driving his detachment back toward a wooded curve in the Little Bighorn. The indigenous warriors pressed their assault relentlessly. Then a bullet struck Reno's scout, bloody knife, in the skull, spattering gore across Reno's face. Shaken to his core, Reno barked contradictory orders: mount, dismount, mount again, before shouting, "Every man for himself! Follow me!" and spearheading a chaotic route back across the river. In their panic, the wounded were abandoned to die. Warriors picked off fleeing troopers as they floundered through the water. Those who survived scrambled up the 8-foot bluffs to a tenable position, where they were soon reinforced by Benteen's arrival. Benteen had been scouting when Custer's hurried note reached him. "Come quick, big village. Bring packs. P.S. Bring packs." The cryptic message suggested Custer was embroiled in combat, but Reno, as senior officer, refused to advance without the lagging supply train. Benteen, desperate to aid Custer, was overruled. Meanwhile, the warriors disengaging from Reno's remnants surged downstream toward Custer's battalion. Gunfire echoed from the river's lower bends, confirming to the men on Reno Hill that Custer was fighting somewhere below, though the exact location remained unclear. Rather than fortify the hill's defenses, Reno descended the bluffs to recover a fallen subordinate's body, leaving Benteen to organize the perimeter. Defying orders, Captain Thomas Weir, disgusted by the inaction, led Company D toward the gunfire. His defiance galvanized others, including Benteen, who followed. From the bluff's northern crest, Weir glimpsed a distant haze of gun smoke 4 miles away, with warriors shooting downward at unseen targets. The Americans assumed Custer had been repelled, but the warriors, finished with their northern quarry, now swarmed back toward Weir and Benteen, peppering the bluffs with gunfire. Benteen orchestrated an orderly withdrawal to Reno Hill, losing only 1 man. There, the soldiers repelled attacks until nightfall. At dawn, indigenous fighters renewed their assault, probing the hill's southern slopes. Yet Reno and Benteen, fortified by the high ground in 300 rifles, held firm. The Lakota and Cheyenne warriors withdrew after failing to dislodge Reno's forces from their hilltop position, their camp moving downriver as the Battle of the Little Bighorn drew to a close. The fate of Custer's detachment remains shrouded in uncertainty, with historians still debating events based on fragmentary accounts. While Reno engaged the warriors, Custer had been advancing along the northern bluffs. Observing Reno's initial success, he continued northward, hoping to seize non-combatants as leverage against the tribes. Custer dispatched 3 companies under Captain Keogh to establish a position on Loose Ridge as a reference point for Benteen's expected reinforcements. Meanwhile, Custer and Captain Yates descended Medicine Tail Coulee toward the river, only to find the village largely abandoned except for scattered warriors. When Company L under Calhoun exchanged fire with these defenders, Custer abandoned his river-crossing plan and instead sought to reunite with Keogh. Keeping Keogh's force on Calhoun Hill as an anchor, Custer and Yates again searched for a crossing point. As they maneuvered, they witnessed thousands of villagers fleeing, far too many for their force to contain. Custer then ordered his troops to consolidate on Cemetery Ridge to await Benteen's arrival, which would provide sufficient numbers to capture the fleeing non-combatants. Meanwhile, warriors who had fought Reno crossed the river and approached Calhoun Hill. As pressure mounted, Keogh committed Company C to defend his right flank through Calhoun Coulee. This proved disastrous. The company's exposed position collapsed under fierce counterattack, with over half its men falling as survivors fled on foot to Calhoun Ridge. In a desperate attempt to stabilize the situation, Calhoun realigned his skirmishers westward, inadvertently leaving his southern flank vulnerable. Warriors quickly exploited this gap while others pressed from the west, shattering the American line completely. Simultaneously, Cheyenne fighters assaulted Company E on Cemetery Ridge, splitting their formation in two. At this critical juncture, the remnants of Keogh's command found themselves hemmed in on three sides as the battle reached its climax. Warriors led by Crazy Horse and other prominent leaders surged forward, throwing the surviving soldiers into disarray. Those who attempted to retreat across Battle Ridge were systematically cut down. Recognizing the deteriorating situation, Custer rallied his remaining troops on what would become known as Last Stand Hill. Custer organized his men into two defensive lines as the final survivors from Keogh's position tried desperately to reach the hilltop, only to be slaughtered in the attempt. Completely encircled and with no natural protection, the soldiers resorted to using their dead horses as makeshift breastworks. In a final gambit, Custer dispatched riders to scatter the gathering warriors, but these too were intercepted and killed, leaving the hilltop defenders completely isolated. The end came swiftly. Under relentless arrow and gunfire, then overwhelmed by warriors wielding war clubs and hatchets, Custer's entire command was annihilated by approximately 5:50 p.m. The 7th Cavalry suffered catastrophic losses. All 210 men in Custer's immediate detachment perished, with total American casualties reaching 268. In stark contrast, the victorious Lakota and Cheyenne warriors lost only about 50 men, a stunning reversal that defied contemporary expectations. For Reno's besieged troops, the full extent of the disaster remained unknown until June 27th, when Terry and Gibbon's relief column arrived. The news of Custer's total defeat shocked the survivors, who had never considered such an outcome possible against Native American forces. Ironically, this decisive indigenous victory ultimately proved Pyrrhic. Custer's death became a powerful symbol that galvanized public support for intensified military campaigns against the Plains tribes. Within 12 months, most participants in the Little Bighorn victory had surrendered. Sitting Bull fled to Canadian exile while Crazy Horse capitulated in May 1877, only to meet his end later that year during a controversial arrest attempt at Pine Ridge. Native resistance persisted until its final suppression at Wounded Knee in 1890, marking the close of a tragic chapter in American frontier history. Custer's last stand became legend, but the real story is far darker. Sitting Bull's prophecy came true, not just for the 7th Cavalry, but for his own people. His victory at Little Bighorn didn't break America's resolve. It ignited its wrath. So tell me, was this a triumph or a curse? Did Sitting Bull win the battle only to lose the war? Or was this the moment Native resistance truly began? Drop your answer in the comments, because history is never as simple as it seems.